Hey everyone, thank you for sticking with me through this mini series of videos. This is the third installment. If you've not watched the other two, I recommend that you do so. Links to those videos are down below. As some of you may recognize, this is my Linux computer build. This computer has been my sandbox, and so I use it to test different things such as different parts, software, and even learn Linux. In this case, you will see many of the parts that we'd covered in the previous video and some that we didn't. So let's go over what we have. So in here we have the motherboard. It's a little hard to see, but that's in the back, and that's what everything is basically mounted to. If it's not mounted to the case, it's mounted to the motherboard. And so the motherboard is what allows everything to communicate and talk via zeros and ones. Mine is a little bit older. It's an older machine that runs DDR3 as DDR3 RAM, and as I mentioned in the last video, buy a motherboard and RAM that are DDR4 instead. They're faster, newer, and they're going to be working a lot better for a lot longer than the old DDR3 machines. So I recommend going new. So in here, I've got, under this heatsink, I've got my processor. My processor goes to the motherboard and snaps on in there with the holder, and then you must use thermal paste to connect your heatsink to your processor. They're both supposed to be completely smooth, but there's going to be just a little bit of gap in there, and so the thermal paste will seal that gap, but it'll also seal those two together. Your heatsink also screws into your motherboard as well to help hold it, especially something of this large. For those of you that don't know, when your processor heats up, the thermal paste and heatsink pulls that heat and it comes out. And so when you have air moving through your machine with your fans, the heatsink naturally cools down. Well, what I did here was put an additional fan. It's a 120 millimeter fan that's on the front of the heatsink, and that really blows cold air through there to push out that hot air that the processor is pushing. So that's how I keep it cool. And with this setup here, I can overclock my processor, but I would rather not. That's just how I am. I just don't see a reason for it. As mentioned, I've got DDR3 RAM. I've got four 4 gig sticks. It's hard to see up here. The heatsink and fan is blocking one of those sticks. That's why I suggest putting the RAM in before your heatsink and fan, because sometimes they'll block it, so making it harder to install or swap out. So anyways, I went with the four 4 gig sticks for a total of 16 gigs of RAM, and it's been working great for me. I also have a graphics card. Now again, I mentioned that my computer's a little bit older, so is the graphics card. The graphics card has DVI ports instead of new display or HDMI ports, which is not a big deal. I've got a cable that connects to my TV that has HDMI, and the cable is HDMI to DVI, so that's great. I also have a network card here. This network card, I have it on top of the network port that's on the motherboard, because I have a switch and I connect to 2 different ports. I use it as added security, so if one port fails or is going slow for whatever reason, I've got a backup. That port that could be failing could be on the computer, could be on the switch. This just helps ensure that I get a better connection. So then I also have right here a SATA card. Now this SATA card here gave me the expansion. My motherboard only has 4 SATA ports. I don't have an M2 drive. My motherboard's too old for it, so one option I could do is a PCIe slot, or PCIe card in a PCIe slot with an M2 attachment to it. I haven't done that yet, and I may not in this computer. But this here allows me to have more hard drives. My power supply unit will support up to 8 hard drives. And so while my computer only has 4, or my motherboard only has 4 slots, my power supply allows for 8. So I use this PCIe slot or PCIe card to actually expand the amount of hard drives that I can have. Currently I've got 3 spinning drives and 2 solid state drives. With that being said, I also have 2 optical drives. One of them is actually not plugged in, kind of just filling space really. The other one is plugged in. Just know that your power supply needs to be able to power everything that you have in here. Mine does. I just don't have it connected right now because I don't need 2 optical drives. Power supply, I've got a 650 watt, which I think is a little bit overkill for what I need, but since I keep expanding with PCIe slots, I keep adding hard drives, this here allows me to expand. So even though I had this much more than what I actually needed, now I'm down to this much more than what I actually needed, and so it's working out. As mentioned in the other video, I have 3 fans helping keep this cool. I have one in the front that's pushing in cold air, and then I've got one in the back and one in the top that are taking this hot air and pushing it out as the cold air brings in. And with the flow of air, this helps this fan here help push out some of that hot air from the processor directly into this one, and these 2 are taking that and moving that air. So I've got a lot of air movement going through the computer. I probably have a little bit more than what I actually need at this point in time. So the cool thing with these fans is that there's multiple levels that I can manually adjust for speed, and so I can have them all on low, medium, or high. I've got them all set to medium currently, just because I don't need that much air movement. With that much air movement, just make sure that whatever power supply you have also handles your fans at their highest speeds. So not all of these were covered in the last video, however, I did make some videos about some of these parts, such as the network card and my SATA card. I'm going to put links to those in the to those videos down below as well. So as you look at computer parts, especially motherboards, you will notice that they all look a little bit different based on manufacturer and size. The motherboards really dictate the layout and where each of the other parts are going to go. The case does have some say in that as well. So if you look here, you know, my case says that they are laying flat, whereas like if you have a motherboard that has a port for an M2, it's going to lay flat on the motherboard itself rather than being connected over here with SATA drives. Also, something to keep note of is that, see how my RAM sticks are up and down? Without a big cooler like this, if I just had a small traditional one, this would block some of that air movement. So theoretically speaking, the processor wouldn't stay as cool. So some of the motherboards actually have their RAM sticks laying like this. So when you have a fan blowing air, it goes along those RAM sticks and then through the processor's heatsink and fan. So it really helps double down on the cooling. So if you can find a motherboard that has your RAM sticks optimized for airflow. Thankfully, in a big case like this, it's not as big of a deal, and so I've got 3, technically 4 fans and a lot of space to push that air, so it's not that big of a deal for me. When looking for a case, style is going to be important for most people because it's what you see. You don't want anything ugly. Something else to consider is all of your internals. As you can see with all my hard drives, I actually ran out of space here. I've only got one more slot for a hard drive down here at the bottom because I've used all my spaces. So make sure that your case will fit everything that you need, whether it's hard drives or fans or PCIe ports or PCIe cards, such as a big graphics card. That's one thing a lot of people don't think of. They'll buy a graphics card after building or buying a computer, and then they have a hard time finding the correct graphics card. Nowadays it's a little bit easier because there's so many out there, but that wasn't always the case. So make sure that your case holds everything that you need as well as fits the style that you want. As you may recall from my last video, I mentioned modular power supply units. If you look here, look how nasty my cables look. You know, I've got a couple of cables that are actually tucked in. You can't see them because of the mess of the other cables here, but they're actually tucked in on this back side and on the other side about right here between the case and the hard drive holder. So if I had a modular supply, I would actually not have all this mess in here, and all of my SATA cables would also look a little bit better rather than fighting with power supply cables for space and style. Thankfully, you can't see inside my case, so it's not as big of a concern, but kind of embarrasses me because I prefer nicer cable setups. So I know that I have thrown out a lot of information at you in these last video and this video. If you need to rewatch it if necessary, I encourage you to gather up all the information you can from my videos and then go out and do the research on the parts that you want or need for either repairing a computer, building a brand new computer, or rebuilding an existing computer, which is possible. But definitely get all your information on your parts, make sure everything's compatible. If you have any questions, need any help, definitely comment below, ask below. I'll be more than happy to help you out and give you my suggestions. It's what I'm here for. And as always, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe.